It started with a smirk. Colin Jost, live on Saturday Night Live, looked directly into the camera and dropped the line that detonated across the internet. Apparently, back, but only if she deletes her entire Instagram again. The audience erupted. Laughter filled the studio. Meghan Markle was no longer untouchable. The media machine she had carefully constructed over the years had just been cracked wide open on one of the world's biggest comedy stages. And that wasn't the only punch. Jost continued with biting sarcasm, mocking the performative fairy tale and hinting that the royal brand Meghan had built was more about calculation than character. And suddenly, something shifted. For years, Meghan had positioned herself as a victim of the press, a misunderstood outsider wronged by tradition and trapped by the crown. But with just one punchline, the veil started to lift, and what was waiting underneath wasn't a scandal. It was a pattern. If you're already leaning in and want more unfiltered truth like this, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what we're about to uncover isn't in the headlines, but it's everywhere, just beneath the surface. The internet has a long memory. That's exactly what happened. When an old image resurfaced online, a photo of a luxury yacht, sun-drenched and Mediterranean, on board, a woman lounging in designer sunglasses flanked by businessmen and influencers. The photo didn't have a tag, but to many, it looked eerily like Meghan Markle, faces from her early Suits days, timestamps from a time she claimed to be struggling, and high society names casually mingling in the background. It wasn't about what she was doing in the photo, nothing illegal, nothing provocative, but it was the context. Meghan had spent years selling the story of the underdog actress clawing her way to the top. Not auditioning, not networking, just there. The sunglasses, the champagne, the setting. It didn't scream hardship. It whispered access. Detectives took over, not tabloids, not paparazzi. Just regular people with time, curiosity, and facial recognition software. Former associates were identified, cross-referencing check-ins, guest lists, party footage, all in an attempt to answer one simple question. Who really was Meghan before the palace gates opened? The deeper they dug, the more troubling the pattern became. Names kept appearing. Photos started vanishing. Social accounts linked to Meghan or her friends mysteriously went private or were deleted entirely, suddenly being treated like national secrets. And that's what made this story explode. Because when public figures try to erase the past, the internet doesn't let them. It multiplies the memory. Then came the silence, and not the kind of silence that brings dignity or grace. This was something colder. Calculated Meghan, who had previously gone to war over newspaper headlines, who sued tabloids. No vague Instagram post about misinformation, just stillness. And in a world where noise is constant, silence gets interpreted as guilt. It was the public signal that Meghan's past had officially become fair game again. He joked that Meghan keeps reinventing herself depending on who she wants to impress, a scathing accusation wrapped in humor. And the online world ran with it. That's because people had already started to feel it. The disconnect between the Meghan of palace speeches and the Meghan possibly lounging on luxury yachts in her story is real. Then what else has been real? What else has been scripted, staged, or conveniently forgotten? It wasn't just the image that triggered suspicion, it was the timing. Meghan has spent the past year launching a glossy new lifestyle brand, showing up in perfectly lit interviews, and trying to reframe her image as a wellness entrepreneur and philanthropic thought leader. But just as that new version of herself was starting to take hold, the old photos started surfacing again. The contrast was too sharp, the narrative too inconsistent. And audiences who used to root for her began asking questions they hadn't dared to before. Why does her past keep changing? Why do so many former friends disappear when she rises? Subtle. Social media accounts once filled with red carpet selfies and hangouts with stylists and influencers went dark. Former colleagues who once praised her in interviews started dodging questions. Entire periods of her life seemed to vanish overnight, and the excuse that it was just privacy didn't land this time. Because this wasn't about shielding personal moments, it was about rewriting a public persona. Even people who had once been diehard supporters of Meghan began to notice something was off. The humanitarian speeches, the Vogue covers, the podcast interviews, they all started to feel like polished performances rather than genuine reflections. Her rise from Hollywood C-list to global royalty was undeniably remarkable. But the more carefully constructed her new image became, the more people questioned the foundation it was built on. Some pointed to NDAs, not tabloids, real people, bloggers, podcasters, amateur investigators. They began piecing together how many of Meghan's former acquaintances had likely signed non-disclosure agreements. And while NDAs are common in celebrity circles, the number and the pattern felt unusual. Stylists, assistants, influencers, even minor colleagues, many had suddenly stopped talking. Some deleted old photos. Others scrubbed mentions. And all of it was happening right as Meghan was climbing into the spotlight? Was this just coincidence? Or was it damage control, silent, sweeping, and deliberate? What struck many wasn't the glamour of her past, but the vanishing act of everyone who used to be part of it. Stylists who once tagged her on Instagram, silent. Former co-stars who had once joked about late-night drinks and behind-the-scenes fun, now dodging interviews. Influencers who used to name-drop her in DMs or Speds gone, scrubbed. Like they'd never even known her. That's when people began to notice a strange pattern. Entire parts of her digital history had been cleaned out, not edited, not clarified, erased. Whole chunks of time wiped from the timeline, and the deeper people looked, the more it resembled a media black site. One that had been sanitized. For public consumption, the question wasn't whether Meghan had a past. Everyone does. The question was why that past had been erased so aggressively, and what that erasure was meant to hide. Then came the whispers. Not from journalists, but from ordinary people with timelines, screenshots, and archives. Speculation turned into theory. Theories turned into full-blown investigations. Some pointed to high-level PR consultants and crisis managers working behind the scenes. SEO experts were allegedly hired to push positive stories to the top of search. Results: old headlines and articles were getting buried or die-indexed. YouTube videos were flagged. Entire forums were reportedly targeted with takedown requests. It wasn't a cleanup, it was a digital purge. But here's the thing. In 2025, trying to delete anything from the internet is like trying to unboil an egg. It doesn't work. And every attempt only raises more suspicion. The more Meghan's past was hidden, the more people wanted to uncover it. And the internet, relentless and obsessed, refused to let go. And that's when the tide began to shift. Meghan's rebranding efforts from podcast mogul to lifestyle guru began to look less like transformation and more like reinvention. The empowering speeches, the staged humanitarian trips, the wine label launches, all suddenly looked performative. Not because they weren't real, but because they were delivered without ever acknowledging the road that led to them. The road. She now seemed desperate to pretend never existed. The public isn't unreasonable. No one expects perfection, but they do expect authenticity, especially from someone who built her brand on the idea of being the real one. The outsider who spoke truth to royalty. The strong woman who survived media cruelty and carved her own path. But now, that authenticity was under fire. Not because of who she once was, but because of her refusal to admit it. And that refusal hit hardest when paired with her silence. Meghan had always been quick to correct false headlines. She once sued the Mail on Sunday over a private letter. She took on British tabloids with fierce legal action. She gave an explosive interview to Oprah, accusing the royal family of unspeakable things. She wasn't afraid to speak out until now. Why go silent when you've never been silent before? That silence is what amplified the backlash, because silence in this case looked like strategy, not humility, not dignity, just control. And the public doesn't like being controlled. They don't like feeling manipulated, and they especially don't like being sold a story that keeps changing. At the heart of this growing storm was one photo not scandalous in content, but devastating in implication. A single image from a yacht party in the Mediterranean, surrounded by wealth, surrounded by influence. The timestamp placed it during the same period Meghan had described as her struggling years. No makeup, no glam, no privilege, or so she'd said. But this photo painted a very different picture. It raised the uncomfortable question: was Meghan's rise really from the bottom? Or was it just a carefully curated illusion? And once that question was asked, everything else started to unravel. The speeches about kindness, the narratives of oppression, the Hollywood royalty pipeline that had once felt like a fairy tale, it all began to feel like PR choreography. And people weren't just skeptical, they were angry, because nobody likes to be played. Even the media, once fiercely protective of Meghan, started to shift their tone. Outlets that used to publish glowing profiles began inserting doubt. Headlines started including words like mysterious past, digital cleansing, and unanswered questions, not accusations, but invitations for readers to think twice. And then came the cultural tipping point. Meghan wasn't just being critiqued online. She was being mocked, roasted, parodied. When Saturday Night Live takes aim at you, and the audience cheers. It's not just about comedy, it's about public sentiment, and that sentiment was turning. Colin Jost didn't invent this backlash. He merely held up a mirror. His joke was a reflection of what people were already feeling but hadn't yet heard spoken out loud. That Meghan Markle's fairy tale had cracks. That maybe she wasn't just misunderstood. Maybe she had orchestrated the misunderstanding. And once you plant that seed in the public's mind, it's hard to unplant it. Suddenly, Meghan wasn't. The woman breaking free from the monarchy, she was the woman who had used it. Not the outsider being dragged by the press, but the insider who had always known how to play the media better than anyone. And the public began to wonder, was the palace just her biggest stepping stone? It didn't help that people around her started pulling away, not just quietly, but strategically. Former allies began distancing themselves. People who had once posted selfies with her were now refusing to comment. Journalists noticed when celebrity blogs suddenly pulled old articles without explanation. Social accounts once linked to her disappeared, and it all looked suspiciously coordinated. Even supporters of Meghan's original narrative began to feel uncomfortable, because the question wasn't just whether she had a past. The question was, why is she pretending she didn't? And that's what made this controversy different from everything that came before it. It wasn't sparked by paparazzi or tabloids or royal insiders with vendettas. It was driven by patterns, by consistencies, by silence. And that silence, deafening. As it was, spoke volumes. At the same time, Meghan was rolling out glossy branding campaigns, launching product lines and giving interviews framed to promote empowerment and authenticity. The internet was unearthing something else entirely. A carefully edited past a trail of ghosted relationships. A series of connections that no longer wanted to be connected. It was starting to feel like the Meghan the world was sold. The outsider, the survivor. The feminist icon had been curated as deliberately as a luxury lifestyle brand. It wasn't just about one photo anymore. It was the questions that photo triggered, questions that hadn't been asked or allowed for years. Questions like, why were so many people suddenly unreachable? Why was Meghan Markle, the champion of transparency, evading her own history? Why did it feel like every time something surfaced, it got erased just a little too cleanly? As these questions piled up, the public started to feel manipulated. The supporters who once defended her against royal critics now wondered if they'd been misled. If the entire royal escape story had been less about liberation and more about leverage, if Prince Harry wasn't a partner in her fairy tale, but a stepping stone toward something far more ambitious, that's when the theories started swirling around. Prince Harry's isolation, he's been cut off from his family, disconnected from his former military roles, resettled in another country. And while he may have made those choices willingly, the framing changed. Suddenly, it looked like he hadn't just left, he'd been pulled. By someone with a plan. By someone who didn't just want freedom, she wanted control. Over the story, over the narrative. Over him, and as brutal as it sounds, people started to ask, was Harry really the love of Meghan's life? Or was he her ticket? Even more damning were the online discussions about timelines when Meghan said she barely knew who Prince Harry was before they met. Yet her online behavior, her friend group, and even paparazzi tips from years prior suggested otherwise. It looked less like a chance encounter and more like a well-researched move. Of course, none of this is provable in a court of law. There's no smoking gun, no secret memo. But in the court of public opinion, you don't need hard evidence, you need patterns. And the patterns around Meghan's rise, the erasures, the reinventions, the NDAs, the strategic silence, they were becoming impossible to ignore. Then came the resurfaced claims involving certain high society figures, including vague but persistent whispers of proximity to Prince Andrew's social circles. Nothing confirmed, no direct ties, but just enough overlap in photos, events, and timelines to fuel speculation. Even if the connection was minimal, the damage was already done. Once your name appears in the same sentence as yacht parties, NDAs, and Andrew, the conversation takes on a life of its own. And that's the heart of the issue. It's no longer about truth versus lies, it's about perception. Meghan had once branded herself as the ultimate truth teller, the woman who exposed the palace, the woman who gave voice to injustice, but now she's being framed as the person who demands transparency from others while hiding her own tracks, and nothing burns. Credibility faster than hypocrisy. Colin Jost's joke landed not because it was outrageous, but because it felt plausible. It mirrored what millions were already thinking but didn't dare say. And in doing so, it shattered the last bit of untouchability that Meghan had clung to. When you become a punchline on Saturday Night Live, you're no longer protected by PR, you're public property. Your story is up for dissection. That dissection didn't stop with Reddit threads or TikTok reels. Major podcasts picked it up. Commentators started circling. Even former royal insiders who had previously defended Meghan began pulling back. They weren't calling her out, they were stepping away. And that, in this media age, is the ultimate red flag. So what happens next? That's the question echoing across headlines, videos, and comment sections. Will Meghan confront the past? Will she give an interview? Clear the air? Tell her side of the story? Or will she double down, roll out more polished PR, and hope this storm passes? Here's the truth. Silence isn't neutral. In the digital world, silence is interpreted as intent, it's read as control. And when your entire persona was built on the promise of truth, failing to address the growing gaps in your own timeline becomes the story. The problem for Meghan isn't that she had a life before royalty. Everyone does. The problem is pretending that life didn't exist and punishing anyone who remembers it. That's what makes this backlash feel different. It's not about envy or racism or protocol. It's about trust. And once trust erodes, it doesn't come back. Not with rebranding, not with wine labels, not with soft focus interviews. It's a slow motion collapse. And it didn't begin with Colin Jost's joke. But that joke lit the match. Meghan Markle wanted to be a symbol of resilience, of independence, of transformation. But the more tightly she clings to the script, the more people start to see the strings. And when the mask slips even just a little, everything else starts to unravel, because the truth always finds its way to the surface, especially when someone tries so hard to bury it. If you found this breakdown eye-opening, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. We've only scratched the surface, and the next chapter of this story could be even more revealing.